The candle does not know it is burning, it only knows that the darkness is hungry. Here, in the damp silence of the palace of Belisgard, the air carries the scent of overripe quinces and the metallic tang of old armor. History is often written in blood, but sometimes, in its most cruel moments, it is written in the gasps of a man who cannot stop smiling while his soul departs. Martin of Aragon, the second of his name, the last of the House of Barcelona, lay amidst the heavy velvet of his bed, a landscape of deep crimsons that looked, in the flickering light, like cooling lava. Outside, the year 1410 was dying in the arms of a cold Catalan spring. But inside the king's chamber, time had achieved a strange, viscous consistency. It did not flow, it pooled. There is a particular horror in the isolation of a monarch. To be a king is to be a monument while still breathing. Martin had spent his life as a vessel for a crown that grew heavier with every death he outlived. His son, the young Martin of Sicily, was gone, buried in the dry earth of an island that cared nothing for his lineage. His wives were shadows in the back of his mind. He was a man who had inherited a kingdom but lost the world. He felt the indigestion first as a dull, rhythmic thumping beneath his ribs, the miserere mei of a stomach burdened by a feast of eels and too much grief. The physicians, with their robes smelling of dried lavender and failure, hovered like crows. They spoke of humors, of the balance of bile, of the celestial alignment of Saturn. But Martin knew. He felt the rebellion of his own flesh. The body, after all, is the only prison from which there is no escape, and the walls were beginning to crumble. Time, the king thought, his eyes fixed on a spider navigating the gold leaf of the ceiling, is a scavenger. It waits for the moment of stillness to begin its work. We spend our lives building cathedrals of stone and law, believing that the permanence of the structure will grant us a share of its eternity. Yet, a king is but a pulse in the dark, a temporary heat that the universe is eager to reclaim. The smell in the room was a mixture of rosewater used to wash his fevered brow and the underlying, honest stench of a failing organism. It was the smell of the Middle Ages, the constant struggle between the divine aspiration and the animal reality. Then came the jester. Bora. Bora did not enter the room so much as he manifested within it, a creature of silk and bells who seemed to exist in the spaces between heartbeats. He was the mirror the king was forced to look into when the crown was laid aside. In the hierarchy of the court, the fool is the only one who is truly free, for he has traded his dignity for the right to speak the truth. And the truth, in this hour, was a jagged thing. "Tell me a story, Bora," the king whispered, his voice a dry rustle of parchment. "Tell me something that does not smell of incense or decree." Bora sat at the foot of the bed, his face a pale oval in the gloom. He did not smile. A professional jester rarely does when the audience is the great leveler. He began to speak of a deer he had seen in the forest, a beast that had caught its antlers in the low branches of a willow tree and, in its struggle to be free, had danced itself to death. "He was so graceful, sire," Bora said, his voice melodic and cold. "He leapt and turned, his hooves striking the earth like a drummer. To any observer, he was performing a miracle of movement. But he was only trying to find the sky again." The king listened. He felt the pressure in his chest, the bloating of the eels, the heat of the fever. And then, the absurdity of it struck him, a lightning bolt of pure, nihilistic clarity. He, the king of Aragon, Valencia, Majorca, Sardinia, and Corsica, Count of Barcelona, was the deer. His crown was the willow tree. His life was the dance. A small sound escaped his lips. A titter. It was out of place in this room of prayers and omens. Freedom, Martin realized in that terrifying instant, is not the ability to do as one wishes. It is the moment when one no longer cares what is done. The fear of God, the fear of the void, the fear of the vacant throne, all of it evaporated in the heat of a single, ridiculous thought. He began to laugh. It was not a laugh of joy. It was a rhythmic, convulsive release of decades of repressed silence. It tasted of salt. It sounded like the breaking of dry sticks. The physicians recoiled. The priests clutched their rosaries, their knuckles white as bone. To laugh in the face of the viaticum was a heresy against the dignity of death. But the king could not stop. Every gasp for air brought with it a new wave of hilarity at the expense of his own existence. "The eels," he wheezed, his face turning a dangerous shade of violet. "The eels, they are swimming in the wine." The bells on Bora's cap jingled softly as the jester watched his master. There was a profound, terrible compassion in the fool's eyes. He saw the king finally shedding the skin of the monarch. He saw the man becoming the joke. In the silence of the palace, the sound of the king's laughter echoed down the corridors of stone, past the tapestries of forgotten battles, past the guards who stood like statues, into the cold night of Catalonia. It was the sound of a dynasty ending, not with a war cry, not with a lament, but with the high, thin shriek of a man who had finally understood that the universe has no punchline. The candlelight flickered violently. The darkness leaned closer. The first part of the end had begun, and the king, for the first time in 64 years, was truly, horribly, beautifully alone in his mirth. The laughter of a dying king is a heavy thing, it carries the weight of every silent decade, every suppressed sigh, and every formal nod given to a court that demanded a statue instead of a man. In the second hour of his final night, the laughter subsided into a rhythmic, painful wheezing, but the smile, that terrifying, involuntary stretch of the lips, remained. Martin felt the ghosts of his past gathering in the corners of the room, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. To the physicians, the room was filled with the smell of illness and lavender, but to Martin, it smelled of the sea at Syracuse and the dry dust of the archives where he had spent his youth. He was a man of books and relics, a collector of the past who had suddenly found himself without a future. In the medieval mind, death was not a sudden event, but a journey through a landscape of spiritual accounting. But for Martin, the accounting was already done. He thought of his son, Martin the Young, who had died just a year prior. A father should not outlive his legacy, to do so is to become a bridge that leads to nowhere. The house of Barcelona, which had stood for generations like a fortress against the encroaching tide, was now reduced to a single, gasping chest. Bora, the king managed to croak, his fingers clutching the edge of a silken sheet. "Do you think the stars are laughing too?" The jester did not look up. He was tracing the pattern of the floor tiles with his toe, a geometric labyrinth that led to the center of the room. "The stars, sire, are too far away to care. They are the eyes of God, and God has seen many kings turn into dust. To him, your laughter is just another wind blowing through an empty cathedral." This thought, instead of bringing despair, brought a strange, cold comfort. If the universe was indifferent, then the king was finally free from the burden of being a symbol. For 64 years, he had been the pivot upon which a kingdom turned. He had signed the fates of men, mediated the quarrels of popes, and felt the crushing responsibility of the humane moniker the people had given him. But a humane king is a king who suffers twice, once for himself, and once for his subjects. The air in the chamber grew colder, as if the stone walls were breathing out the winter they had stored for centuries. Martin watched the shadows of the priests as they moved across the wall. They looked like giant, hooded birds of prey, waiting for the soul to flutter out so they could capture it in their golden chalices. Their prayers were a low hum, a background noise that meant nothing to a man who was busy discovering the hollow core of his own divinity. "Is it a sin, Bora? To find the end so ridiculous?" "It is only a sin if you believe the world was meant to be serious, sire," the jester replied. "But look at us. I wear bells and you wear a crown, yet here we are in the dark, and neither of us can stop the sun from rising on a kingdom that will soon forget our names." Time, in the palace of Belisgard, began to stretch like heated glass. Martin remembered the taste of the first grape of summer, the sound of his first wife's laughter before the politics of the court turned her into a shadow, and the heavy, satisfying weight of an ancient manuscript in his hands. These were the only things that were real. The wars, the titles, the succession, they were merely the garments of a life, not the life itself. He realized that we spend our existence preparing for a grand performance, only to find that the theater is empty and the script is written in a language we cannot read. Freedom is the moment you realize you can stop acting. The indigestion returned with a sharp, stabbing reminder of the eels, a mundane, earthly cause for a cosmic departure. It was a final irony, the king of Aragon was being unmade by a meal. The majesty of the throne was being dismantled by a stomach. More light, the king whispered, though the room was already filled with candles. He felt the isolation of the dying, the way the world recedes until it is only the size of a bed, and then only the size of a single breath. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was not a king. He was a boy again, running through the salt marshes of the coast, his feet wet and his heart light, unaware that one day he would be expected to carry the world on his shoulders. He was free because he was nothing. Outside, the owls of Belisgard called to one another, their cries echoing the king's earlier laughter. The night was vast, and the palace was a small, flickering spark in the middle of a dark, indifferent history. The second part of the end was concluding, and the silence that followed was deeper than any prayer. The third hour of the vigil brought a silence so profound it seemed to have its own weight, pressing against the heavy oak doors of the bedchamber. Outside, the guards stood as motionless as the stone gargoyles perched upon the parapets of Belisgard. They were young men, mostly, whose lives were measured in shifts and seasons, unaware that the world they knew, the order of their universe, was dissolving in the labored breaths of the man inside. Martin watched the flickering shadow of a crucifix on the far wall. It looked less like a symbol of salvation and more like a crossroads. Faith, he mused, was the ultimate architecture of the mind, a series of vaults and buttresses built to keep out the terrifying draft of the unknown. But as the physical body faltered, those spiritual walls seemed to grow translucent. He could see through them now, into a vast, shimmering void that was neither heaven nor hell, but simply space. "They are waiting for my last word, aren't they, Bora?" the king asked, his voice now a mere silver thread of sound. "They want a sentence to carve in marble. A final wisdom to justify the taxes and the tithes." The jester, still perched at the foot of the bed, adjusted a small, tarnished bell on his sleeve. "A king's last words are rarely for the living, sire. They are usually an apology to the dirt. But if you must give them something, tell them that the crown was cold. It will make the pretenders hesitate for at least a heartbeat." A faint, ghostly chuckle vibrated in Martin's chest. The humane king. He thought of the thousands of documents he had signed, parchments that moved grain, declared peace, or granted mercy. He had been a clerk of destiny. Yet, in this moment, not one of those letters held the weight of a single breath. The scent of the room had shifted. The sharpness of the lavender had faded, replaced by the smell of ancient dust and the cold, damp earthiness that rises from old foundations at night. It was the smell of the archive, the place where Martin had felt most at home. He had always preferred the company of the dead to the noise of the living. The dead were consistent, they did not change their loyalties or plot in the shadows. "Time is a thief that returns nothing," Martin whispered to the ceiling. "We believe we are accumulating life, year by year, like gold in a treasury. But we are actually spending it. By the time we feel wealthy with experience, we find the coffers are empty." He thought of the House of Barcelona, a line of blood that had flowed through the history of the Mediterranean like a great, crimson river. He was the terminal point. The river was reaching the sea, and in the vastness of the salt water, the sweetness of the stream would be lost forever. There was a profound, quiet tragedy in being the one to turn out the lights on a century. The jester stood up slowly, his movements fluid and strangely dignified. He walked to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain just an inch. A sliver of moonlight, sharp as a blade, cut across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "Look, sire," Bora said softly. "The world is still there. The trees do not know you are leaving. The owls are still hunting. The wind does not hold its breath." Martin looked at the light. He felt a sudden, piercing envy for the dust motes. They had no kingdoms to lose. They had no lineages to fail. They simply existed in the light until the light moved, and then they existed in the dark. Is that freedom, then? The king asked. To be so small that the world cannot find a hook to hang a title on you? Perhaps, the jester replied, letting the curtain fall. The room returned to its amber gloom. But only a king could understand the luxury of being small. The rest of us spend our lives trying to be large enough to be noticed by the reaper. The king's hand, spotted with age and the pallor of the end, reached out as if to catch a memory. He felt the phantom sensation of a sword's hilt, the smoothness of a royal seal, the warmth of a child's forehead. These were the anchors of his soul, but the tide was rising, and the ropes were fraying. In this third hour, the transition began. The king was no longer fighting the laughter or the eels or the physicians. He was beginning to listen to the silence. It was a patient sound, like the ocean wearing away at a cliff, inevitable, rhythmic, and strangely beautiful in its persistence. The crown of Aragon was becoming a circle of lead, and the man beneath it was finally, slowly, beginning to let go of the weight. By the fourth hour, the candles had begun to weep trails of wax that looked like frozen tears. The king's laughter had long since dissolved into a fragile, rhythmic clicking in his throat, the sound of a clock winding down its final spring. Martin was no longer in Belisgard, he was wandering the corridors of his own memory, where the light was always golden and the weight of the crown was yet to be felt. Bora, he whispered, his eyes unmoving, fixed on the darkness above. I see them. Not the saints. Not the kings. Just the faces of those I couldn't save. It's strange, isn't it? We build monuments to our victories, but we are haunted only by our silences. The jester was no longer sitting. He stood by the hearth, where the fire was a heap of glowing embers, pulsing like a dying heart. The soul is a ledger, sire. We try to write our names in gold, but the ink that lasts is always the water of our own tears. You were called the humane. That is a heavy debt to carry into the earth. Martin felt the truth of it. To be humane in a century of iron was to be a bird with wings made of glass. He thought of the beggars at the gates of Barcelona, the widowed mothers of sailors lost in the Mediterranean storms, the nameless soldiers whose lives were the currency of his reign. He had felt their pain, yet he had presided over their world. Is power, he wondered, merely the ability to watch others suffer while standing on a slightly higher piece of ground? A king is a man who has traded his shadow for a statue, Martin said, the words coming with immense effort. We spend our lives making sure the statue is perfect, while the man beneath it withers in the dark. And now, the statue is breaking. I can feel the cracks. The smell of the room had changed again. It was now the scent of cold iron and ozone, the sharp, electric smell of a coming storm. Outside, the sky was bruised with purple clouds, and the first distant rumble of thunder shook the floorboards. The natural world was finally acknowledging the shift in the human one. Listen, Bora murmured. The sky is clearing its throat. It has a story to tell that doesn't involve your lineage. Martin closed his eyes. He imagined the rain falling on the dry fields of Aragon, soaking into the earth, nourishing the roots of trees that would outlive the memory of his name. There was a terrible beauty in that continuity. The king dies, but the grass grows. The crown falls, but the rain remains. He thought of the concept of legacy, that glittering trap we set for ourselves. We believe we can extend our reach beyond the grave through our children, our laws, our buildings. But legacy is just a ghost we hire to haunt the living. True freedom, he realized, was not being remembered, it was the grace of being forgotten, of returning to the elements without a trace of the ego left behind. I am ready to be nobody, Bora, the king breathed. You were always nobody, sire, the jester replied, his voice devoid of mockery, filled only with a deep, ancient kindness. The crown was just a very loud way of pretending otherwise. Now, the music has stopped, and you can finally hear your own heartbeat. The thunder rolled closer, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in Martin's very bones. He felt the dissolution of his titles. The King of Aragon was vanishing. The Count of Barcelona was a mist. What remained was a man, cold and tired, listening to the rain begin to tap against the glass like 1,000 small fingers asking to be let in. The fourth hour was closing. The transition from the monarch to the element was nearly complete. In the flickering light, the king's face looked like a landscape of valleys and ridges, ancient and peaceful, as he prepared to step into the storm. The fifth hour arrived not with the strike of a bell, but with the relentless rhythm of water. The storm had broken over Belisgard, and the rain lashed against the stone walls with a primal fury that made the palace feel like a ship adrift in a dark, forgotten sea. Inside the chamber, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the guttering smoke of candles that had finally surrendered to the draught. Martin's breathing had slowed to a shallow, hesitant whisper. The laughter that had defined the beginning of this long night was now a distant memory, a strange fever dream that had passed. In its place was a clarity so sharp it felt like a blade. He watched the water run down the window panes, distorting the world outside into a series of weeping, grey shapes. "The world is washing itself clean of me, Bora," the king murmured. There was no fear in his voice, only a quiet, academic interest. The jester was standing by the window now, his silhouette a dark jagged line against the flickering lightning. "Not clean, sire. Just changing. The water that falls on your roof tonight will be the wine someone drinks in 100 years. Nothing is ever truly lost, it just forgets its name for a while." This thought resonated in the hollow spaces of Martin's chest. He had spent his life trying to preserve names, titles, and lineages, to freeze the flowing river of time into a static block of ice. He saw now the futility of it. The greatness of a king is not measured by the stone he leaves behind, but by how gracefully he returns to the flow. "I spent so much time fearing the end of my line," Martin said, his eyes tracing the path of a single raindrop. "I thought if there was no one to carry the name, the story would stop. But the story doesn't belong to the House of Barcelona. It belongs to the wind and the rain." He felt a sudden, profound compassion for those who would come after him, the pretenders, the ambitious, the dreamers of empires. They would all, eventually, find themselves in a room like this, realizing that the crown was always a borrowed thing. To rule is to hold a handful of sand and wonder why it slips through the fingers. Is faith enough, Bora? To step into that water without knowing where the shore is? "Faith, sire, is just the name we give to our courage when we are too tired to keep our eyes open," the jester replied softly. "You don't need to know where the shore is. You just need to remember that you were always part of the sea." The king's heart gave a slow, deliberate thud, like a heavy door closing in a distant part of a house. He felt the isolation of his position dissolve. He was no longer a king sitting above his subjects, he was a brother to the rain, a cousin to the thunder. The barriers of class, power, and history were melting away in the damp heat of the room. The silence between his breaths grew longer. In those gaps, he heard the true voice of the world, not the shouting of heralds or the chanting of monks, but the low, ancient hum of existence itself. It was a song without words, a melody of pure being that required no throne to justify its beauty. "It is so quiet now," Martin whispered. "That is the sound of the weight being lifted, sire," Bora said, stepping back from the window. He approached the bed, his bells silent, his face softened by a grief that was also a blessing. The fifth hour was fading into the sixth, the final hour, where the candle would meet the dark, and the laugh of the king would finally become the silence of the man. The storm outside continued its work, indifferent and magnificent, as the last of the House of Barcelona prepared to become a memory. The sixth hour arrived with a ghostly pallor, the first hint of a dawn that the king would never see. The storm had spent its rage, leaving behind a world that dripped with the quiet, rhythmic fatigue of the exhausted. Inside the chamber, the last candle had guttered out, leaving only the faint, grey light of the approaching morning to illuminate the final scene of the House of Barcelona. Martin lay perfectly still. The struggle was over. The eels, the indigestion, the bloating, and the laughter had all been subsumed by a vast, cool neutrality. He felt as if he were made of smoke, rising slowly from the heavy, ruined architecture of his body. Bora, he whispered, though the word was barely more than a thought. The joke. I think I finally understand it. The jester, who had remained by his side like a faithful shadow, leaned in close. His bells were still, and the playful mask of the fool had been laid aside for the last time. And what is it, sire? What is the punchline of 1,000 years? It is that we were never the masters of the story, Martin breathed, a faint, beautiful smile touching his lips, this time, a smile of genuine peace. We were only the ink. And the ink must eventually dry so the page can be turned. He thought of the centuries of kings before him, men who had bled and burned and built, all believing they were writing a permanent truth. But time is a palimpsest, it scratches away the old names to make room for the new, and in the end, the parchment itself is all that remains. The House of Barcelona was not breaking, it was simply being rewritten into something else. A final, soft sigh escaped him, not a gasp of pain, but a long, slow release of a breath he felt he had been holding for 64 years. The heart of the humane king gave one last, quiet beat and then rested. Bora stood for a long time in the silence, watching the features of the man he had served settle into the cold, immutable dignity of the dead. He reached out and gently closed the king's eyes. The room was now filled with the pale, indifferent light of morning. The birds in the palace gardens began to sing, their voices bright and sharp, oblivious to the fact that an era had ended in the room above them. The jester walked to the door, but before he left, he looked back at the bed. The crown sat on the side table, a circle of gold that looked strangely small and hollow in the grey light. It was no longer a symbol of power, it was just an object, a relic of a dream that had finally reached its conclusion. Sleep well, Martin, Bora whispered. The world is in other hands now. And the rain has already forgotten our names. History would record the death of Martin the Humane as a strange, almost farcical event, a king who died of laughter and indigestion. But the truth was far more silent and far more beautiful. It was the story of a man who found his freedom at the very moment he lost his world. The laughter was not a symptom of madness, but the sound of the soul finally recognizing its own insignificance in the face of the infinite. The House of Barcelona was gone, vanishing like a ripple on the surface of a deep, dark pool. But the pool remained, reflecting the sky, waiting for the next stone to fall. And in the damp silence of Belisgard, the only thing left was the scent of wet stone and the quiet, bitter, yet beautiful realization that everything, in its time, must return to the wind.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.